Welcome to my podcast, Scientist Free from Religion. This podcast has as proposal, as main idea to talk about the scientific topic, but also talk about religion. Different from the common assumption in which science and religion should be separated, here on this podcast we recognize formally that science and religion are not disconnected. Sadly, religion can be a very big threat to science. So on this podcast, the proposal is to talk about it freely, so without fear, without the illusion that they are separate topics. So we are going to cover a possible topic. Most of them will be focused on the connection between religion and science, especially to defend science. That's our goal. Our goal here is to defend science from religion and to help to make science, to spread scientific thinking, especially to defend it against religion.
You know, there's this idea that feels really right, doesn't it? The one you hear quite a bit now.
Mm-hmm. Which one are you thinking of?
The one where people say, look, science is finally proving what Buddhism, these ancient traditions have been saying for centuries.
Oh, yeah. That convergence narrative has definitely gained a lot of traction. Sounds incredibly satisfying, too.
It really does. Like this beautiful meeting point between ancient wisdom and modern knowledge. It feels good. But, and this is what we're digging into today, there might be a catch. A subtle, but maybe pretty significant flaw hidden in that kind of thinking.
That's a great point. Because while the idea of convergence is appealing, the actual meaning of proof or validation in a strict scientific sense, well, it's much more complex, much more demanding than it often seems.
Right. Are we really seeing science validate these traditions, or is it more like pattern matching, finding connections because we want to?
Exactly. Are we seeking a comforting story, maybe, that just confirms what we already hope is true?
That's precisely the fascinating and I think really important territory we're exploring in today's deep dive. We're navigating a lively debate sparked by two really insightful articles from the Scientists Free from Religion blog.
Ah, yes, that platform. It often features perspectives from scientists and thinkers looking at where science and religion intersect, often critically, highlighting an atheistic viewpoint informed by science.
Exactly. So first up, we'll look at Nathan Arellano's piece, Psychology, a bridge between science and spirituality. He basically proposes that psychology has this unique role, acting as a kind of meeting ground.
That it can use its methods to, in a way, validate some of these ancient spiritual insights through scientific investigation.
Then we pivot straight to a direct rebuttal. Dr. Jorge Pires wrote, From Buddha to the Talking Snake, Why Scientific Convergence Isn't Validation.
A fantastic title, by the way.
Well, it really is. And he directly challenges Arellano's core idea. He argues pretty forcefully that, finding overlaps is interesting, maybe even useful, but it is not the same as scientifically validating an entire belief system. Far from it.
And just to add another layer here, Dr. Pires also wrote a related piece called What Counts as Science? A Rebuttal to Reductionist Definitions. In it, he actually critiques the very definition of science that Arellano used initially.
So it gets into some really fundamental questions about what science even is in this context.
Absolutely. Definitional debates are often at the heart of these discussions.
Okay, so our mission today, for you listening, is to really unpack these arguments. We want to get into the nuances of what science means here and help you think critically about how these different ways of knowing science, tradition, personal experience interact, especially when we talk about these profound human experiences.
It's about equipping you with the tools to navigate these complex conversations yourself.
All right, let's dive in. Okay, let's start by really getting inside that perspective. The one that sees psychology as this unique connector, this bridge.
Right. What's really key in Arellano's argument is how he frames psychology. He's not saying it's a hard science like, physics or chemistry, strictly hunting for objective, measurable proof all the time.
So not just about numbers and physical laws.
Exactly. He sees it more as a discipline that's actually willing, maybe even uniquely equipped to explore subjective human stuff, feelings, experiences, consciousness, including things traditionally labeled spiritual.
And he thinks it can offer scientific reinterpretations of old spiritual ideas.
That's the phrase he uses.
Yes.
Which immediately brings up the question, okay, if psychology is the bridge, what are the two shores it's connecting? How does he define science on one side and spirituality on the other?
Good point. You need clear definitions for that. So what's Arellano's take?
Well, For Arano, in his initial framing at least, science is basically a method of understanding reality through observable, measurable evidence. He really emphasizes objectivity, experiments, proof.
Kind of the classic view.
Yeah, very much so. And he adds that if something can't be measured or replicated easily, what he calls traditional science tends to doubt it. It's a view that, as we'll see later, Pyers takes issue with, but that's Arellano's starting point.
Okay, observable, measurable evidence. That's the science, sure. What about the spirituality, sure?
Spirituality, for Arellano, deals with the non-material aspects of life.
Yeah.
So think meaning, purpose, feeling connected to something bigger than yourself, awe, inner peace, that sort of thing.
Things that are hard to put in a test tube.
Precisely.
Yeah.
He acknowledges that insights here usually come from personal experience or ancient wisdom, not lab experiments. Ideas like, the soul, enlightenment, feeling a divine purpose, these inherently resist the kind of proof science typically demands.
So you've got these two realms, science demanding proof, spirituality dealing with inner experience, and historically they haven't exactly spoken the same language.
Right. Arana suggests this led to a situation where inner experiences often just got dismissed. Oh, that's just subjective or that's unscientific. A real gap opened up.
And psychology steps into that gap.
That's Ariano's argument, because psychology is a science. It uses experiments, surveys, statistics, but its focus is the human mind, behavior, subjective feelings, beliefs. It naturally studies things that overlap with spiritual teachings.
Like meditation or feelings of awe.
Exactly. But it approaches them in a systematic, research-based way. So it uses scientific methods to explore terrain that overlaps with spirituality, effectively building that bridge Ariano talks about.
Okay, so with science defined one way, spirituality another, and psychology as the bridge, Ariano then gives examples of this bridge in action, right? Showing how psychology takes ancient wisdom and, well, puts it to the test.
Yeah, he's trying to show how psychology can provide these scientific reinterpretations of ideas that have been around for ages, taking concepts that maybe felt mystical and seeing if they hold up under scientific scrutiny.
And the first big example he uses is mindfulness meditation. Can't really avoid that one these days.
It's definitely the most prominent example. Mindfulness, as he points out, has roots going back thousands of years in Eastern traditions. Buddhism, Hinduism primarily for achieving inner peace, self-awareness, that kind of thing.
But in the West, scientifically speaking, it wasn't taken seriously for a long time.
Not at all. Ariano notes it was often dismissed as just mystical mumbo-jumbo, unprovable. But then, psychology started looking at it, crucially, under the secular banner of mindfulness.
Stripping away the religious context.
Pretty much, focusing on the techniques themselves. And pioneers like John Kabat-Zinn were key here. He brought mindfulness into medical settings in the 70s with mindfulness-based stress reduction, or MBSR.
Right, for chronic stress and pain. He made it evidence-based, secular.
Exactly. He consciously framed it that way to make it acceptable to the medical and scientific communities.
Yeah.
And then the research started pouring in.
And Ariano highlights some pretty impressive findings, like that big analysis from 2023.
Yeah, Zuo and colleagues, over 12,000 participants. They found mindfulness-based therapy was basically as effective as things like antidepressants or standard cognitive behavioral therapy for anxiety and mood disorders. That's a significant finding.
It really is not just a vague feeling of calm, but measurable clinical effects.
And lots of other research backs this up. Consistent findings show reductions in depression, anxiety, stress. Some studies even suggest it improves sleep quality. These are tangible benefits, the kind science looks for, stemming directly from a practice rooted in spiritual tradition.
And now it's everywhere. Hospitals, therapists, corporations, schools. It's gone totally mainstream. 1 in 6 U.S. adults meditating, apparently.
It's a huge shift. And for Ariano, this is the poetic outcome. He says something like, the East already knew the power of meditation, and now Western science and spirituality can coexist.
So psychology took this spiritual tool, tested it rigorously, translated its benefits into scientific language, and enriched our understanding of mental health. That's the bridge in action, according to him.
That's his argument for mindfulness, yes. A prime example of scientific reinterpretation.
Okay, from mindfulness, Ariano moves to another, maybe more complex example. Carl Jung. Archetypes. The collective unconscious. This stuff feels inherently more, well, mystical.
It definitely does. And that's what makes Jung such an interesting figure in this context. Ariano highlights Jung's willingness to blend empirical observation, working with patients, collecting data with these really big abstract ideas.
Like archetypes, these universal symbols he saw everywhere.
Exactly. Jung was struck by how similar myths and symbols were across totally different cultures. You see the great mother, the hero, the wise old man, the shadow figure popping up again and again.
And he explained this with the collective unconscious?
Right. He proposed this idea of a shared universal layer of the psyche. Like a psychic inheritance we all share, filled with these archetypes. Arlano quotes Wing, calling it a vast spiritual heritage resurrected in each individual brain structure. Kind of poetic, really.
Poetic, but also sounding pretty spiritual itself. How does Arellano connect this back to the science-spirituality bridge?
Well, Jung saw these archetypes, the mother, hero, shadow, and especially the self-archetype, representing wholeness as mirroring deep spiritual themes. He even talked about the self-archetype as sort of the God within, this drive towards growth and realization.
So Jung was taking a spiritual concept, the higher self, maybe, and exploring it psychologically.
That's Arellano's interpretation. Jung was trying to map this inner, arguably spiritual landscape using psychological concepts. Now, obviously, this stuff is hard to test in a lab.
Yeah, Jung got criticized for being too mystical, right?
He did. It lacks easy falsifiability. But Arellano points to some indirect lines of evidence, like evolutionary psychology noting universal fear responses, snakes, darkness hinting at maybe innate patterns.
Or comparative mythology, like Joseph Campbell finding the hero's journey everywhere. Campbell was influenced by Jung, wasn't he?
Heavily influenced.
Yeah.
And his work showed these recurring narrative structures across cultures, suggesting some kind of universal psychic template which resonates with Jung's ideas.
So, for Arellano, Jung's legacy is opening the door in psychology for discussing things like myth, symbolism, even mystical experience.
Yes. He sees Jung as tackling that spiritual idea that we are all connected, but trying to give it a psychological, if not strictly empirical, framework. Another plank in the bridge, connecting the inner world of meaning with the observational approach of psychology.
All right, mindfulness, Jung. And Arellano's third example brings us right up to current research, the emotion of awe.
Awe is a great example because traditionally it's almost always been talked about in spiritual or religious terms, hasn't it?
Totally. Staring at the stars, a Grand Canyon, seeing incredible kindness. People often say they feel the presence of something greater.
Exactly. And for a long time, science didn't really know what to do with that. How do you measure presence of something greater?
Seems impossible. But Arellano and psychologists are studying it now, rigorously.
They are. They're treating awe as a distinct, measurable emotion and looking at its effects. And what they're finding, Arellano argues, aligns beautifully with what spiritual traditions have said for centuries.
Like what specifically?
One key finding is the small self effect. When people feel awe, their sense of self kind of recedes. It's not about feeling insignificant, but more like the ego quiets down and you feel more connected to others, to the world, to something bigger.
Feeling part of a larger whole.
Precisely. And scientifically, awe is now classified as a self-transcendent experience, alongside things like deep meditation or flow states. Arellano points out that language like transcendence, connection, presence of something greater terms, once confined to spiritual discourse, are now appearing in scientific papers describing these experiences.
So the subjective experience maps onto scientific categories now.
And it goes beyond subjective reports. There are measurable benefits. Studies show inducing awe, maybe just by watching a nature video, makes people measurably kinder, more generous, more helpful.
Really? Just watching a video?
Apparently so. It also boosts mood, reduces stress, increases curiosity, even makes people less materialistic.
Wow. So experiencing awe, this quasi-spiritual emotion, actually changes behavior in ways that align with virtues like compassion and humility, which spiritual traditions have always emphasized.
That's exactly Arellano's point. He sees this as clear evidence of psychology validating the real-world benefits of experiences long considered spiritual. It's like science is nodding and saying, yeah, there's something genuinely beneficial here and we can observe its effects. He even mentions how positive psychology explicitly includes concepts like gratitude, forgiveness, and transcendence as key virtues for well-being, validating what spiritual teachers preached for centuries.
Okay, Arellano lays out a really compelling case there. Mindfulness, Jung, awe, psychology as this bridge, seemingly validating spiritual insights with scientific methods. But this is where it gets really interesting, because Dr. Jorge Perez comes in and says, hold on a minute.
Right, this is the crucial pivot. Perez's core argument is incredibly direct. A convergence between science and tradition is not the same thing as validation. He doesn't just disagree slightly. He calls the assumption that they are the same sloppy thinking and potentially dangerous.
Dangerous? Why dangerous? What's the fundamental error he sees?
He sees it as an epistemological mistake, a flaw in how we're thinking about knowledge and proof. He argues that this desire to see validation everywhere leads us to build belief systems based more on how nice they sound, their aesthetic appeal, rather than on solid evidentiary strength.
So it feels good to see the overlap, but that feeling isn't scientific proof.
That's the essence of it. He's demanding a much higher standard for what counts as validation in a scientific context. It's not enough for things to just resonate.
And he starts by revisiting Jung, who Arellano presented as a key bridge builder. How does Pyers see Jung in this context?
Well, Pyers acknowledges Jung is popular for exactly that reason, bridging science and the mystical. But he immediately throws up a caution flag. Just because something sounds profound or feels deeply meaningful doesn't automatically make it scientifically valid.
So Jung's ideas like synchronicity, maybe they offer insight, but they aren't science.
That's Pyers' point. He argues concepts like synchronicity lack the falsifiability and methodological rigor that science demands. You can't really design an experiment to disprove synchronicity in a clean way. It's more interpretive.
Falsifiability, the idea that a scientific claim has to be potentially provable wrong.
Exactly. If a theory can explain anything that happens, it's not really explaining anything scientifically. Pyers worries that selectively importing these kinds of untestable, mystical-sounding ideas into a psychological framework isn't real science.
It's more like constructing a preferred narrative.
That's the risk he identifies. Building a belief system based on aesthetic appeal rather than evidentiary strength. Choosing ideas because they feel profound, not because they've met rigorous scientific tests.
Okay, so that critique of Jung sets the stage for Pyers' main target, what he calls the science as proven Buddhism fallacy.
Yes, he says this is a narrative you hear everywhere. TED Talks, popular books, social media. It's become almost a cliche.
And the classic example he gives is, Buddhism talked about the mind affecting the body, and now, look, we have neuroplasticity. Science proves Buddhism was right.
Right. Pyers is very careful here. He says the statement isn't totally false in its parts. Neuroplasticity is real. Some Buddhist ideas relate to mind-body connections. But the conclusion drawn, science proves Buddhism, is, in his words, entirely misleading.
And he breaks down why it's misleading into three main points. The first one is cherry-picking.
This is crucial. Pyers argues that proponents of this view selectively highlight only the bits of a tradition like Buddhism that seem to align with current science. They pick the cherries.
Like mindfulness having benefits.
Exactly. They focus on that, which is scientifically studied. But they conveniently ignore or downplay all the other parts of Buddhism, like karma operating across lifetimes, literal rebirth, various cosmological claims that are either contradicted by science or, more often, are simply untestable by science.
So you focus on the validated part and ignore the rest of the system.
Precisely. You don't hear people saying neuroplasticity proves the Buddhist concept of rebirth because, well, it doesn't. Pyers says it's like picking the sweet berries and declaring the whole thorny bush is delicious fruit.
Okay, cherry picking is the first issue. His second reason is a logical fallacy called affirming the consequent. Sounds technical, but he explains it well.
He does make it clear. It's a fundamental error in reasoning. You have a big theory or worldview, like Buddhism or astrology. It makes various predictions or has various components. If one of those predictions or components seems to match reality, like mindfulness reducing stress or your horoscope saying you'll meet someone and you do, you then wrongly conclude the entire big theory must be true.
Ah, right. His analogy was the horoscope one. My horoscope was right today, therefore astrology is real.
Exactly. The fact that one prediction came true, maybe by chance, maybe due to some minor correlation, doesn't logically validate the entire system it came from. So even if mindfulness works for stress, that specific finding doesn't suddenly prove the whole complex Buddhist philosophy or its metaphysical framework.
That makes sense. It isolates the claim from the whole system.
It demands that each part be evaluated on its own merits.
And the third issue Pyers raises is confirmation bias, a classic human tendency.
We all do it. We instinctively look for, interpret, and remember information that confirms what we already believe or suspect. Pyers says when we see an apparent link between science and tradition, we notice it, we emphasize it, it feels significant.
And we conveniently ignore the contradictions.
Or the vast number of claims within that tradition that science hasn't validated and maybe never can. Pyers puts it succinctly. We cling to parts that feel validated and silently drop the rest. It lets us keep a neat, comfortable story going, even if the reality is much messier.
So, putting these three together, cherry picking, affirming the consequent confirmation bias Pyers lands on a pretty sharp conclusion.
He does. He says, this isn't science. It's belief shopping with a lab coat on.
Ouch. Belief shopping with a lab coat. That's memorable.
It really is. It paints a picture of someone picking and choosing convenient ideas to support what they already want to believe, and then dressing it up in the authority and language of science, the lab coat, to give it legitimacy it hasn't actually earned through rigorous testing. It's a critique of intellectual honesty, really.
And to hammer home just how absurd he thinks this logic of convergence as validation is, Pyers uses that brilliant reductio ad absurdum argument involving Christianity and a talking snake.
Yes, this is probably the most provocative part of his article, but it makes his point incredibly effectively. He says basically, if you accept the logic that mindfulness works, therefore Buddhism is validated, then why not apply the same logic elsewhere?
So he suggests, tongue-in-cheek, maybe Christianity was right about the talking snake in Eden. Science hasn't disproven it. Maybe one day science will prove snakes can talk.
It sounds ridiculous, obviously. And that's the point. He's using the absurdity to expose the underlying flaw in the original reasoning.
The flaw being that you can't take validation of one specific claim and use it to validate the whole mythology or worldview it came from.
Exactly. Just because one element might seem to align or hasn't been definitively disproven doesn't lend any scientific credibility to the entire narrative structure, whether it's Buddhist cosmology or the Genesis creation story.
So each claim needs to stand or fall on its own scientific merit.
That's Pyers' relentless message. Whether a claim comes from religion, philosophy, or science, it must stand on its own merit. Test it individually. Don't grant it validity just because it's part of a system where another part seemed to align with some scientific finding. Otherwise, he concludes, you're not doing science. You're engaging in metaphysical wish fulfillment. You're looking for comfort, not truth.
Okay, so if convergence isn't validation, and we need to avoid metaphysical wish fulfillment, what is the right approach, according to Dr. Pyers? What's the scientific gold standard here?
Hey there, thanks for being around. We are going to make a small break. I'm going to share with you my books. I have several books. So far, all my books about religion, atheism, which have been published a lot, they are in Portuguese, which is my main focus. But if you are interested, you can still buy my books to help me to support my work. I have several books. For example, one book that I'd like to recommend now is AI by Sci-Fi. AI by Sci-Fi is a book that talks about artificial intelligence, which is everyone is talking about artificial intelligence with ChatGPT, all this amazing stuff that they can do. They can talk, they can create video, they can create podcasts. This podcast, for example, there are several episodes that was recorded using artificial intelligence, which is amazing how I can do that. I can even interact as you could see in several episodes. So I would like to invite you to buy my book AI by Sci-Fi. It's available on Google Books, Google Play. It's also available on Amazon. So you can buy my book. If you are interested in something a little bit more complex, a little bit more technical, I do have as well technical book. For example, I have one book about computational thinking, in which I talk about Kasparov. It's a technical book. Greg Kasparov was the first guy to be beaten by a computer. He has a very nice book about that, how artificial intelligence overturned the difference between human and artificial intelligence. So please buy my book and offer me all the support. You can find all of them on Amazon. Hopefully, in the future, I'm going to write also about religion, atheism, and science. But I do have a podcast. I do have a blog called the Scientists Free from Religion. The same name of the podcast. And you can find several already publications about several topics in which talk about science, religion, and atheism. So, hope you enjoyed the show. So, let's come back to the show.
Pyers argues very strongly for intellectual humility and rigorous skepticism. He wants us to resist the allure of easy, comforting stories where everything fits together nicely. Science's gold standard, he says, is definitely not spiritual resonance.
Not how good it feels or how profound it sounds.
No. Instead, he says the gold standard is claim-by-claim testing, rigorous skepticism, and the willingness to discard even beautiful ideas when evidence contradicts them. That last part is key, being willing to let go of cherished ideas if the data doesn't support them.
So break it down. Test each piece individually.
Precisely. Apply this to spiritual practices. If mindfulness reduces stress, great. Test it, retest it, build models based on the data. But Pyers insists that says nothing about samsara or karma. Those are separate claims requiring separate evidence. Each claim has to earn its place scientifically.
And this applies across the board, not just to Buddhism.
Absolutely. He explicitly says the same standard holds for evaluating claims from Christian ethics, Stoic philosophy, Jungian psychology, anything. Science's job isn't to go around validating ancient worldviews. Its job is to test reality.
Overlaps are interesting, maybe starting points for research, but not conclusions.
Exactly. He calls them interesting, but never sufficient grounds for wholesale adoption of an entire belief system. You can't just accept the whole package because one part looks promising under a scientific lens.
And he wraps this up with that call for intellectual humility over narrative coherence.
A really powerful phrase. He's urging us to resist the easy comfort of stories where everything aligns neatly, where science and tradition seem to perfectly agree. He argues science is strongest when it's skeptical, not when it's trying to blend things together, syncretic.
So the scientific approach asks, interesting idea, let's test it.
Yes, not, see, they knew it all along. Because, as he warns, if you fall into the trap of taking one overlap as proof for a whole system, you might find yourself logically committed to defending things you really shouldn't be defending scientifically.
Like the talking snake.
Like the talking snake, which, he dryly notes, would be decidedly unscientific. It's a call for rigor over comfort.
Now, all this talk about validation, testing claims, what science can and can't do, it really circles back to that fundamental question. What actually counts as science? And interestingly, Pyers tackled this head-on in that other article, didn't he? Challenging the definition Arellano initially used.
He did. What counts as science? A rebuttal to reductionist definitions. It's crucial because how you define science dramatically shapes what you think it can investigate and validate.
So Pyers quotes Arellano's definition again. A method of understanding reality through observable, measurable evidence thrives on objectivity, experimentation, proof. If a phenomenon can't be measured or replicated, traditional science tends to cast doubt on it. Kind of the classic, maybe Newtonian view.
Exactly. And Pyers immediately argues this classical view, rooted in that Newtonian framework, is no longer sufficient. He thinks it's too narrow, too reductionist.
Why? What's wrong with demanding observable, measurable evidence?
Pyers argues that sticking strictly to that definition risks excluding vast swaths of legitimate scientific endeavor. He specifically mentions psychology, history, theoretical physics, even parts of philosophy that are crucial for science.
He makes a historical point too, doesn't he? That science didn't just start with Newton.
Right. He emphasizes that systematic inquiry existed long before Newton. Aristotle classifying animals, Alhazen studying optics empirically in the Islamic Golden Age. Newton refined methods, especially quantification. He didn't invent the scientific impulse. Pyers says limiting science just to Newton-specific methods is ahistorical and anti-intellectual.
So what about fields like psychology or paleontology, the soft sciences or historical sciences?
Pyers defends them vigorously. Psychology uses statistics, controlled experiments, replicable methods to study mind and behavior. Yes, humans are variable, which adds complexity, but does that make it unscientific? Pyers says no. Similarly, historical sciences like paleontology or evolutionary biology reconstruct the past based on evidence, inference, corroboration. They don't run experiments on dinosaurs.
But they use rigorous methods based on the available evidence.
Exactly. Pyers warns that rejecting these fields just because they don't fit a rigid lab coat stereotype is misguided.
He even uses string theory as an example, right?
Right.
Something highly mathematical but not currently testable.
Yeah, it's elegant, explanatory, mathematically consistent, but no direct experimental proof yet. Does that mean it's not science? Pyers suggests maybe Popper's strict falsifiability rule isn't the only criterion. Science also involves building models that might become testable later, organizing knowledge systematically. It's a process.
He also mentions deductive versus inductive reasoning.
Right. Science uses both. Theoretical physics often uses deduction from principles. Statistical sciences often use induction from data. Defining science only through one lens, Piers argues, is intellectually impoverished.
And he stresses the connection to philosophy.
Absolutely. He argues philosophy is inseparable from science because it defines the very tools science uses. Logic, validity, causation, inference. Think of Einstein's thought experiments, basically philosophical tools that revolutionized physics. Without philosophy providing that epistemological foundation, Piers says, science loses its footing.
And then Piers brings in this really specific, pointed example about the Christian apologist John Lennox. This feels like it gets to the heart of the Scientists Free from Religion blog's focus, too. He calls it apologetics by definition.
This is a really critical part of his argument about defining science. Lennox often argues that modern science really took off in 16th, 17th century Europe, Newton, Kepler, Boyle, etc., precisely because these figures believed in a rational creator who made an ordered universe knowable through reason.
Implying Christianity was necessary for science to flourish.
That's the implication. But Piers doesn't see this as just a historical observation. He calls it a theological narrative disguised as epistemology. He argues Lennox is defining real science in a way that deliberately privileges this specific Christian context.
And by doing so, ignoring or downplaying earlier scientific contributions.
Exactly. Piers says this narrative conveniently overlooks Greek rationalism, Indian mathematics, the massive contributions of the Islamic Golden Age, Chinese natural philosophy, all systematic inquiry into nature that occurred much earlier and in non-Christian contexts. He calls Lennox's approach historical revisionism with an agenda.
The agenda being to suggest science somehow needs Christianity.
That's what Piers claims Lennox is trying to smuggle in. The idea that because, according to Lennox, Christianity birthed science, science remains dependent on it. Piers calls this logically fallacious. His analogy is brilliant. Because humans once needed training wheels. All bikes require training wheels forever. Just because something might have helped at the start doesn't mean it's essential now or defines the thing itself.
So Lennox's definition excludes huge parts of scientific history to make a theological point.
That's Piers' accusation. He says Lennox ignores Greek achievements, Indian math, Islamic science, Chinese philosophy, all of which involve systematic, rational, often empirical inquiry to fit his narrative. Piers argues this isn't just bad history, it's weaponizing definition for theological gain.
So for Piers, this isn't just academic nitpicking. It's about who gets to define rationality.
Precisely. He says this kind of argument reinforces a myth that religion, specifically one religion, is the source of reason, and secular science is somehow less grounded. He sees it as gatekeeping the very idea of rationality itself, a really strong critique.
Okay, so if Arellano's initial definition was too narrow, too Newtonian, and potentially misused, like in the Lennox example, what's Piers' alternative, his better definition of science?
Piers argues we need to move beyond that restrictive view. His proposed definition is broader. Science is a systematic enterprise that builds and organizes knowledge in the form of testable, or at least intellectually rigorous, explanations and predictions about the universe.
Systematic enterprise. Testable or at least intellectually rigorous. That sounds more inclusive.
It's designed to be.
Fine.
It accommodates historical sciences like paleontology, probabilistic ones like psychology often is, theoretical ones like string theory, and interdisciplinary work. Crucially, it values intellectual rigor, even if immediate testability or falsifiability isn't possible right now.
So science is more of a living process than a fixed set of rules.
That's exactly his point.
Right.
He calls science a living, evolving methodology with fuzzy, not fixed boundaries. Trying to freeze the definition based on one historical period, like Newton's, distorts its history and its current practice. He sees it as respecting complexity rather than imposing a simplistic, outdated model.
Wow. Okay, we have covered a lot of ground here. From Arellano's idea of psychology bridging science and spirituality, with examples like mindfulness and awe.
To Piers' sharp rebuttal that convergence isn't validation, warning against cherry-picking and using his talking snake analogy.
And then diving deep into the very definition of science itself, contrasting that narrower view with Piers' broader, more inclusive one. So let's try to synthesize this. What does this all mean for us, for you listening?
Well, I think what really emerges is this fundamental tension, doesn't it? There's this deep human desire for meaning, for coherence, for that grand synthesis Arellano hints at, where science and spirituality neatly align.
That comforting feeling that they knew it all along.
Exactly. But then you have the scientific imperative, which Peirce champions, demanding rigorous, claim-by-claim testing, skepticism, and that hard willingness to discard ideas, even beautiful ones, if the evidence just isn't there.
And psychology sits right in the middle of this tension, doesn't it?
It really does. It does investigate subjective experiences that hard sciences might ignore. It does use scientific methods to study things like awe or the benefits of meditation, things that resonate with spiritual concepts. Arellano is right about that unique position.
But the crucial nuance is the meaning of validation.
Absolutely. The benefits of mindfulness for stress reduction. Yes, science can and does validate that specific claim through empirical testing. But, and this is Peirce's unwavering point, validating that specific effect doesn't automatically validate the entire Buddhist worldview, including untestable claims like karma or rebirth.
The talking snake problem again. You can't prove the whole system just because one part checks out scientifically.
Precisely. And interestingly, Peirce's broader definition of science, the one that explicitly includes psychology and theoretical physics, actually strengthens the case that psychology is a legitimate science capable of studying these complex human phenomena.
But even with that broader definition, his core argument about validation still holds.
It does. Because even a broader science still demands rigor. It still requires testing individual claims skeptically. It doesn't give a free pass to entire worldviews just because they contain some scientifically testable elements. The call remains for intellectual humility.
So the takeaway isn't necessarily that science and spirituality are enemies, but that we have to be really careful and intellectually honest when we talk about how they relate.
Exactly. Approach claims of convergence with humility and skepticism. Recognize that science's strength often lies in that skepticism, in its refusal to accept comforting narratives over hard-won evidence.
So for you, our listener, what's the practical upshot? You've heard these two really thoughtful, detailed arguments. Hopefully this equips you to better evaluate claims you encounter.
Right. Now you can more easily spot the potential pitfalls, the cherry-picking. Look, this one part matches. The affirming the consequent. If this part is right, the whole thing must be. You can appreciate why science insists that each claim has to earn its own credentials through testing.
It's about critical thinking, really, applying that same rigor, whether you're reading a scientific paper, a self-help book, quoting ancient wisdom, or even just scrolling through social media.
Asking those precise questions. What exactly is being claimed here? What specifically has been tested? What does the evidence actually support versus what's being inferred or hoped for?
It empowers you to navigate this complex intersection of knowledge without falling into easy but potentially misleading conclusions. Okay, as we wrap up this deep dive, here's something to chew on, a final thought. In this very human search for meaning and connection, think about this. Is the desire we often feel for science to validate spiritual wisdom, is that a sign of intellectual progress, a genuine attempt to build bridges?
Or could it sometimes be masking a deeper yearning, a desire for certainty or meaning that maybe goes beyond what empirical evidence alone can truly provide?
How can we, as curious people trying to understand the world, embrace both the profound insights that come from human experience, from tradition, from spirituality, and hold on to the rigorous demands of scientific inquiry?
Can we navigate that space without falling into what Peirce called metaphysical wish fulfillment? Without demanding that science confirm things, it simply isn't equipped to confirm.
That tension itself between seeking meaning and demanding evidence is not necessarily a problem to be solved, is it? Maybe it's actually a really rich, dynamic space for ongoing exploration, something to keep thinking about.
Hey there, you arrived to the end of this episode. You can always check out my YouTube channel and also keep watching because there are 7 episodes. So you just if you enjoyed this one, hopefully you are going to enjoy the next one. I always like to remember that you can support my work by buying my books. Even though I still don't have a book about religion, which is the main topic of the podcast, I do have a book about artificial intelligence. And also I have a blog called Scientists Free from Religion on Medium. And there are several blog posts there, and you can enjoy it, you can read it, and you can subscribe to my YouTube channel, you can share it with your friends. So hopefully I can hear from you and hope you had an amazing time. So hope to see you in the next episode.